Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Alice Van, and I'm the Executive Director here at STARK, a Center for Social Research Innovation. We're thrilled to welcome you to today's STARK Talk, this tale of two method cultures hold. I'd like to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the lands where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility to respect and honor the intimate relationship that Indigenous peoples have to these lands. We're thrilled to welcome Ingo Rohlfing and David Kuehn. Ingo is Professor of Methods of Empirical Social Research at the University of Passau in Bavaria. Primary research and teaching interests are social science methods, an emphasis on causal inference, qualitative and multi-method research, and research transparency and credibility. And David Kuehn is a senior research fellow at the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, GIGA, in Hamburg, Germany. His work focuses on democratization and autocratization, with a special emphasis on civil military relations and the political role and power of military. We are thrilled to welcome them here to Canada today and look forward to the talk.
Thanks so much, Alison. Thanks for the kind intro and for inviting us and for organizing everything so perfectly. So Ingo and I were very happy to talk about this project. And I just, in the precursor to this, I spoke to Alison briefly, and I just realized that it has been a long time in the making, this project. And we have been working and thinking about these issues for a very long time, at least until 2014, might be even longer, which also gives you an indication of how old we actually are. So just briefly, in the next maybe 50 minutes or so, we want to have a little engaging, maybe a little bit workshop type style of presentation. What is this now? So workshop type of presentation. So it will not be like totally frontal, but maybe a little bit back and forth. And so Ingo will share the slides with all of us. So I will go first, and then in the second half, Ingo will take over. And can I make this small? Yes. So Ingo will take over, and in the end, I hope we'll have some time for open discussion and some Q&A. But as I said, we will try to have it a little bit more engaging, and we hope for a lot of an engagement from you in the audience. Does the tale of two methods cultures hold up? And as said, so this has been a long-term project that Ingo and I have been following for some time, and it also came a publication out of it, a very nice publication from Sociological Methods and Research. I get to that in a minute. So the goal of the project is actually an empirical analysis of systematic differences between qualitative and quantitative research practices. And all this is based on the very well-known seminal book by Gary Gertz and James Mahoney of 20, which actually is the further development of an earlier article they have published in Political Analysis in 2006. And the book is called A Tale of Two Cultures, Contrasting Qualitative and Quantitative Paradigms. And the slides are also in the chat, and you can download it. And yeah, this is this is the book. It's a very nice book. It was very well received, got a lot of attention and a lot of discussion. And I don't think that whenever you get like a methods course and think about qualitative and quantitative methods, that you can get around it, reading it, or at least noting its existence.
At least in political science.
Yes, that might be one additional thing to say, that Ingo and I were both political scientists. So while the Tale of Two Cultures argument was made from perspective on social sciences as a whole, our work actually, and then it's a nice segue to the SMR paper, we focus on the political science side of things. And of course, we would be super interested in hearing if some of you come from different disciplines, to hear what you think about this and maybe learn how it's different in your disciplines or subdisciplines. So what we did then is actually an empirical analysis of the argument made by Gertz and Mahoney in A Tale of Two Cultures, and the main results were published in almost 2 years ago in an article in Sociological Methods and Research. And you can find the link also in the slides that Ingo already shared. Next slide, please. But before we go into what we did in this article, we would like, as I said, we would like to hear and learn from you what you think qualitative and quantitative means, like in the social sciences and especially in your field. What are the differences? Are there any systematic differences between the two, or is it just buzzwords? Really, maybe you have some ideas we can collect a little bit. Ingo will collect it and we will try to make a little bit like a systematic, and from there then go to the book has to say and how we then tested the analysis or the argument. Ingo, should people just write something in the chat or should they just speak?
Whatever they prefer, I think.
All right. So don't be shy, just put stuff in the chat, or you can also just speak. Don't need to raise your hand. I don't see it anyway.
I'll throw it out. I think of quantitative as being good at measuring what and some how questions, and qualitative being really good at measuring why questions or exploring why questions.
Okay. And we have from Melissa in the chat, Ingo, qualitative is depth and quantitative draws on breadth.
Nice. Are you all from political science? At least Alison, or?
No, my focus is public policy and some economics.
Okay.
Not policy. Amy's in health research. Yeah.
Cool. We have quantitative with numbers versus qualitative words. Thanks, Joseph. And Amy suggests from her perspective in health research, quantitative modeling. Probably this should be qualitative. First one. Quantitative is survey-based interviews, and is that supposed to be qualitative? The second one, because we have a quantitative twice there. I guess the first one is supposed to be quantitative. The second sentence is qualitative. First one is quantitative is modeling. No worries.
Interviews, interpretation.
Okay, Sonia has her hand.
Hi, actually, I have the engineering background and I'm interested on working, like integrating the social part in my studies, as it is one of the pillars of sustainability. So my understanding that qualitative is to the quality of the information, deals with the quality of the information, like the feedback from the stakeholders. For example, if we are doing a survey, and the quantitative is how to quantify that and put it into math or something like that. That's my understanding.
Okay, so qualitative says something about the quality of the data, the information, and the quantitative, then you said it's more like the numbers?
It's how to quantify those information into like numbers.
Okay, so we have another focus by Zefeng on quantitative pays more attention to explaining and qualitative more on exploring. So one is probably testing and the other building new theories.
What should I put down now? It was first explaining, right?
Yeah, quantitative, yes, exactly. Explaining, and qualitative would be exploring. And Alexandra, from the perspective of the sociology of education, quantitative allows me to investigate on a large scale, while qualitative allows me to gather detailed experiences from smaller groups of participants. Again, the breadth versus depth distinction, I would say.
Large and smaller. Okay.
Yeah, and from Melissa, qualitative seeks to understand different perspectives. So this understanding focus, maybe the difference, the Weberian difference between understanding and explaining, I guess that's meant here. Yeah, I think this is very already extremely insightful. Also that you all seem not to have difficulties in coming up what qualitative and quantitative respectively mean, or especially in your field. And interestingly, we also have this little gray box in the bottom, as you can see, where maybe both could come in, and we don't have anything there. which is fine because we asked what the difference between qual and quant is, and it's totally fine then that you focus on that. The interesting thing is when I spoke with Alison before the meeting officially started, she highlighted the importance of multi-method research. And of course, in order for multi-method research to actually make a contribution, you need some kind of like room between, some kind of an area where qualitative and quantitative somehow meet. And that is actually one of the arguments that we're making. And we will get back to that in a minute. But I think these two bubbles that we have created now, the qualitative and the quantitative distinction, I think this is all very clear, and there are clear-cut differences between the two methods, perspectives or families, or as Mahoney and Gertz would call them, cultures. And that is exactly the argument that the two are actually making. And Ingo, if you go back to our slides again, please. The interesting thing is what Tale of Two Cultures doesn't really do is to clearly define in a single sentence or something, or like in a single very clear argument, very clear sentence or a few words what qualitative and quantitative is, like in where the differences are. They go like from a different perspective. And they're saying that qualitative and quantitative research is based on different coherent sets. It's a collection of individual things, and these are values, beliefs, and norms. And those are associated with, that's the direct quote from the book, they are associated with and also translate into distinctive research procedures and practices. And as noted, it's not as like a single thing that is the difference, but it's multiple things, and it's a multidimensional concept that they develop. It's sets of individual different practices, how qualitative and quantitative research differ, like in real life. And if we go to the next slide, please. What Mahoney and Gertz do is they define the differences between qualitative and quantitative research in 5 dimensions. And they argue these 5 dimensions in their entirety, in their whole, constitute different cultures. And these 5 dimensions are how they treat cases and how relevant individual cases are versus the population. They differ in how they treat and understand causality and causal models. They differ in the population and how they treat data. They differ in the concepts they use. So how do they define, conceptualize, operationalize, usually the dependent variable, but also the independent variables. And finally, whether they are conceptually and how they treat conceptual and causal asymmetry. And just going very briefly through these 5 sets of these 5 dimensions. In qualitative research, typically the goal is to explain the outcome of an individual case or a small number of individual cases. Causality is understood in set relational terms. That means in necessary and sufficient understanding, necessary and sufficient conditions. They tend to engage in-depth analysis of a small number of cases with the aim of generalizing findings to a narrowly defined context. In terms of concepts, qualitative researchers usually understand the measurement of the operational variables as a semantic process of defining and bringing into some kind of logical relationships a multitude of concept dimensions. So we have a multi-dimensional conceptual approach. And finally, in terms of asymmetry, qualitative research is characterized by asymmetrical causal arguments and concepts. In contrast to quantitative researchers, typically are not primarily interested in explaining the outcome of individual cases, but more towards the broader population. So the breadth versus depth argument that we found out in our selection round before. Secondly, in terms of causality, it's not set relational as Mahoney and Gertz suggest for the qualitative research, but rather they understand causality in linear terms, the average treatment effect of individual variables. In terms of data, of course, breadth versus depth again, large N, so a large number of observations, large number of cases in order to allow for broad generalizations across a multitude of contexts. In terms of conceptualization, operationalization, qualitative researchers conceive variables as latent that are operationalized with clear empirically testable indicators. And finally, typically quantitative research do not include asymmetric causal arguments or asymmetric concepts. And the core argument that Mahoney and Gertz make is that these are descriptive, positive statements. This is not prescription. This is not normative. They're not saying that qualitative and quantitative research should be like this, but they argue that this is the way it is in practice.
In political science still, and sociology. Yeah. So if something sounds weird to you, like a symmetry, which you may have not heard about before, one of the last comments was also about variation. This then has to do with this being, I would say, specific debate that has been going on or is going on maybe in political science and parts of sociology. Sorry.
Totally fine. It's so the question then is, so what? Why should we care? If this is descriptive, positive statements, why should we care whether the two culture hypothesis is right or wrong? And from our perspective, it's important. First of all, if actually qualitative and quantitative research are so fundamentally different as this five-dimensional juxtaposition suggests, then qualitative and quantitative results could not directly inform each other because they're built, for example, on different understandings of causality. And that, of course, would inhibit multi-method research. And finally, the point has to be made that even if it's meant as a descriptive thing, as a descriptive statement, it could become prescriptive if students especially, but also like junior colleagues or advanced colleagues who want to look into a little bit more methodological grounding, if they read this and understand if this is how it's done, then it maybe should be done like that. And from that perspective, we thought that it might be valuable and interesting and important actually to check whether this two cultures hypothesis and the five dimensions that are supposed to explain and describe the differences between qualitative and quantitative research, whether this hypothesis is actually true. And with this, I hand over to Ingo.
Yeah, thank you. For disclosure, we may also say we both didn't really believe that the hypothesis is true when we started. So it was a guiding hypothesis. It may also have biased us a little bit against finding evidence of the hypothesis, although I think the evidence is pretty clear-cut. But this was also what we believed. Then the question was, at least it was about 12 years ago or so when we started this. So our question was, okay, how would we do it? How can we test this empirically? So just from the top of your head, so how would you do this? How would you do research? It's basically research about research, right? So how would you do an assessment of how research is done? And you don't have to imagine that it's because now we have 2024 and more means available for doing this. So you can just go wild and say, how would you do it? No idea?
No, Amy writes in the chat a review of methods being used in a field. I can take a look at the chat, no problem.
Yeah. This may be mature what we have done. So I'm not sure about all the differences that are made. So I know meta-analysis, and I have heard of scoping reviews, but I'm actually not sure what's the differences between a systematic and scoping review. Could you explain this, Amy? Also because just I'm curious. I always wanted to know actually what it is.
Yeah, at least in my field, systematic review often is like much more structured. It's built on also analyzing the sort of quality of the work that you're reviewing, whereas in scoping review is more for if there's a limited amount of papers published in an area and you just want to say what is being done right now, what is being said, and you're not comparing like the quality of the studies against each other.
Oh, okay. Okay, now I know. Thank you.
Okay, Alison writes, journal articles self-identifying as qual or quant.
Yeah, this would be the selection strategy, and that's important to keep separate or distinct. There's on the one hand the self-identification, and usually it's not like researchers say this is a quantitative study because it's usually not always, but usually obvious whether it's a quantitative study or a qualitative study. But this is what the research method really is. And most of the time when we were screening articles or sampling articles, it was easy to determine whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And this is different. So just what method is used, this is different from the method's culture. So the culture or the supposed culture that is, say, reflected in the article, this depends then on the 5 dimensions that David introduced. And each dimension, you see it later, following Mahoney and Gertz, has 5 methods, practices, or design choices subsumed. So you have 5 dimensions. On each dimension, they specify Mahoney and Gertz, or Gertz and Mahoney in this case. They specify 5 practices or choices. So you have 25 different methods, practices in total that define the 2 cultures. And this is then what we looked at in more detail in self-identifying or easy to identify qualitative and quantitative articles, whether the articles that are obviously quantitative do quantitative research in the way that is described in A Tale of Two Cultures. And the same for the qualitative articles. So do qualitative researchers what A Tale of Two Cultures says they are doing in general? I'm not sure whether it doesn't matter anymore, but whether we did a systematic review. So we could not, of course, read all research that has been done. This would be more something for machine learning or maybe also AI-based research now. So what we did was more the, could say, traditional manual approach. So first, and we have this briefly then on one of the next slides, we were thinking about if this grand argument about the 2 cultures is true, and if we look at the 5 dimensions with 5 practices each, so what should we then observe when we read qualitative and quantitative empirical research? And we came up with 5 observable implications. So it's standard theory evaluation or theory testing, I would say. It's only that it's a theory about research in A Tale of Two Cultures, and it's not a theory about an empirical, political, or social economic phenomenon. Yeah, but it's standard empirical research actually that we are doing, just with a very maybe peculiar focus. So we had then to think about how can we identify then a certain methods practice in an article. So we had to operationalize the 25 methods practices more or less precisely described in A Tale of Two Cultures. This was our code book. And then we sampled articles that students' assistants were very helpful in this process. We sampled 100 articles in total so that we could get information or data. So we coded them to produce data about how methods are practiced in 90 qualitative and quantitative articles each. And it's a stratified random samples because we wanted to take multiple dimensions into account that were important for one reason or another. One was we wanted to cover different periods of time. And so we decided to slice the last, 25 years about into 3 different periods. There's a certain rationale behind this, but it has to do with how methods developed in political science. So it's enough here to say that we wanted to have a longitudinal perspective. Then we had the periods, and then we had identified 6 journals. So usually, and this was also the case here, you go with the prominent, well-known journals. So not only the top journals in political science, or what are considered the top journals, but journals that everyone knows. So the journals themselves were not that important, but we wanted to have some variety in terms of European-based journals or ECPR journals, which is the European Association, and American journals, and international relations, and comparative politics, and so on. Then we also had, for each journal period, 5 qualitative and 5 quantitative articles each. So this means that for one journal in 1990, we had 5 qualitative and 5 quantitative articles that were sampled randomly. So the journals were not random, but the article sampling was random. And this was then how we came up with 180 articles in total that we then coded based on the codebook. And this was just done by reading them. So each of us, we have left out the details here. We can say more about this later. Each of us read all the 180 articles and then was going through the article saying, okay, that's now a case of a set relational qualitative article because, and then a quantitative article was estimating an interaction effect, which is important according to A Tale of Two Cultures and so on. Today, one may do it differently in a more automated way, but we did it manually. And it wasn't really reading the articles, it was more very selective screening of the articles to find the parts where we can code something as being present or absent with regards to what we expect based on A Tale of Two Cultures. Okay, if you have questions, of course, you can always jump in and you don't have to wait until the end. Briefly on the 5 observable implications, we try to present them here in an accessible manner. And they may seem obvious, but in the results that they are in practice not as obvious as one may think. So the practices, these always refer to the 25 methods choices or design choices or just practices that are defined in the book. And of course, you would expect that if a practice defines a culture, then it should most of the time be practiced. Otherwise, it cannot be a culture. So this is a straightforward requirement that we have this in the appendix just as a backup, doesn't hold up empirically. And so some 6 of the practices that are described in the book and presented as constitutive for the 2 cultures, they are mostly not relevant because researchers just don't do these choices. They don't make these choices in practice. The second one is, so that's a little bit more statistical. If there were these 2 cultures, then you would be able to project the 25 practices if they were coherent on one dimension. And this is what we use the factor analysis for, and the results are not that bad, but they're also not strong enough to suggest that 25 methods practices, according to our coding, can be projected on a single methods dimension. Third, when you look at combinations of pairs, like how are cases chosen in qualitative and quantitative research, if there were coherent practices, then this should be correlated highly with any of the other 24 practices. If one practice, if the 2 cultures argument was right, then if one practice, then you would be able to predict 24 other practices. And this means in a pairwise analysis, they should be correlated highly. Going from second point here to the fourth, from the general, so one dimension, to the very specific level of looking at individual practices. So again, for quantitative research, for example, the expectation was it's random sampling, which should be by the textbook if you do a significance testing. For qualitative research, it's not just intentional choice of cases, but with limited variation on the outcome, which again has a certain background as an argument in political science. So this means that if the 2 cultures argument was right, then most qualitative researchers should choose the cases in the way as it is described in the book. And the final point, and I show then results on the next slide briefly on this. And the final point, that's again related to the period. We would expect that because of the way in which the methods debate developed in political science since the mid-1990s, that even if the 2 cultures weren't that prominent or strong in the 1990s, we should see them in a better way or stronger way or more pronounced way at the beginning of the 2010s, so in the third period. This is as you can see, it's just descriptive statistics. No causal analysis. We are not interested in the reasons why something is done, at least not with our codings. It's a descriptive analysis that serves to evaluate the two cultures argument. So we want to show you then one result for the fourth implication, which is, I think, maybe the most fundamental one. It could still be that the other three are true, which they are also not entirely, but maybe the fourth one is easiest to understand and also most insightful. So let me just briefly talk you through this. So we have different colors here for the two self-identified articles. So applied method is what we referred to as self-identified method before. Then we have on the x-axis the pair of articles that use the practice. So the unit of analysis is the individual practice, which you have here on the y-axis. And they are numbered. It's not 25 because of what I said before, 6 practices just don't matter. They are not done simply, so there wasn't anything to code. So it's not 25 in total here, but it goes from 1 to 25. And what you then would expect is if the two cultures argument was right, then all the points, so which are basically point estimates, they should be somewhere on this side of the plot. Yeah, so most articles should focus on individual outcomes in a certain way if they're qualitative and not do it in a certain way if they're quantitative. Yeah, so this means for the first practice that we have in the codebook, the two cultures argument is confirmed. But the grand picture is what, so in particular for the qualitative articles, it's more or less all over the place. So in rare cases, maybe here, the share of articles that use or make a certain decision or practice something in a certain way is high. We have here articles that do basically the opposite of what you would expect based on the tale of two cultures. And then there's a huge gray area where it's about half what the articles are doing. So for the qualitative articles, there is no clear picture. For the quantitative articles, that most of them, also not all, but most of the articles do what you would expect if there was a quantitative culture. And the picture is we have different statistics or different ways of analyzing the data for different implications, but it's more or less what we also have, second next slide, more or less always the same picture. It looked pretty good for the quantitative articles, and it doesn't look good or mixed as best for the qualitative articles. If we flip the perspective, so here we have now the article as the unit of analysis. Now the question is, if you look at a single article, how many of these 25 practices, or maybe only 19 practices, are on the article level implemented or made in a way or done in a way as you would expect it? And also on the article level, it looks very strong and as expected for the quantitative articles. So you can say even the least quantitative article from the two cultures perspective has at least 75% of all the practices done in a way as you would expect it. The qualitative articles are again all over the place. Some are where you would expect them to be if the two cultures argument was right. There, if you would like to see examples of what the qualitative culture looks like, you would have to pick one of these three. But then we have the huge variation, as you see, and also a couple of articles that are actually quantitative as judged by the culture, although they are obviously qualitative by design and by the method and data that they use. So regardless of how you look at this, the evidence is good, strong for the quantitative culture, except for some minor deviations, but it looks good. So from the hypothesis testing perspective, you would say it's confirmed. And this has probably to do with the higher level of standardization that you have in quantitative research. Yeah. This then probably goes back to the standardization of teaching, that everyone who learns statistics, most of the researchers who learn statistics learn it in the same way. And there's also a certain standardized way to present it. And from our perspective or experience, these articles were also relatively easy to code. For the qualitative culture, there's little evidence that there is a coherent set of practices. You could see it in the one figure that I've shown. You can also see it in the figures in the appendix that we can pull if you like and discuss more observable implications. The question for us was then also for participants of previous talks, why is this? And some were also saying, okay, we are not surprised, and maybe you could expect this, but why is this? And what else do we then have in the qualitative application field or in the field of qualitative articles, if not the one culture? David introduced the 5 dimensions before, and there was one called asymmetry, and for the dimension of causality, it was about set relations. So maybe I can just quickly jump back. So this here. So set relational causality, this is what David said. It's about necessity and sufficiency, and asymmetry, which is closely related to set relation, is an entire dimension. And particularly for these dimensions, they don't work. It doesn't work in practice. So qualitative methods aren't practiced in an asymmetric manner, and very rarely you have set relational reasoning. And on the notes, the board that I used before, I think no one brought something up which was just close to set relations or asymmetry, which probably also indicates that this debate is for reasons that we could discuss particular to political science, but which influences in particular Jim Mahoney's line of thinking, and which then had a strong influence on their thinking about the 5 dimensions. But empirically, it doesn't show in how research is done. So luckily then for us, I would say luckily, because there's another article which was also a response to A Tale of Two Cultures by Koivu and Kimball, and they say there isn't one culture, but there are 3 cultures, or we could say clusters, so practices, which they define. They don't have an empirical analysis on whether their argument is right, but we have the data, so we checked whether it's right, and it looks pretty good. Yeah, this was an exploratory analysis, but I think the data supports the argument that we have 3 subtypes of qualitative research. One is in style and thinking about causation and so on. It's like quantitative research, but as we had it before with words, not numbers. We have a larger group, or also a large group, that is so it mixes the method choices as it's necessary or appropriate. And then you have some qualitative and some quantitative elements according to the cultures argument. And it's very small share, but it's in our data, a very small share of articles. They are set theoretic. So these are the articles, these 8% that are very close to the 2 methods argument for the qualitative culture. Yeah, but you see it.
Ingo, just briefly,
Yeah.
in the chat, Alison asked whether you could just very briefly explain what set relations and the symmetry looks like in a qualitative study.
Yeah. Okay. For set relation, we would have to say that a certain event happened because something else was present before. If a cause is present, then the outcome should be present too. So the toy example, which has a lot of empirical background and theoretical background, is the argument about the democratic peace program or democratic peace phenomenon, which has a long history, but in the data, you can see that if 2 countries are democratic, then they don't fight each other. We could supplement this with a mechanism. So if there is a democracy in 2 countries, then they don't fight each other. That's a third relation argument, because then you would need to give a reason. Then you would still be in a set relational worldview, and you could analyze then, do process tracing, or what we call process tracing, then with a single case. Yeah. At least it would be necessary to use set relational terminology, which is saying if then or only if then, but we very rarely had this in the articles. Asymmetry, yeah, that's harder for me to explain because I don't buy into this, but also don't really understand it. From quantitative research, correlations or also treatment effects or causal effects are always estimated, or they can only be estimated if you compare different states with each other. And for a specific reason, which has come a long way in political science, there is the argument that you can also think in asymmetric ways. So if you know that a democracy, to put it simply, is a cause of peace, it doesn't mean that you can say what the outcome is, so peace or war, if you have a non-democratic country. So if you're used to statistical thinking, it may be a little bit hard to get into this way of reasoning, but this is meant with asymmetry.
And maybe just to add to this, because there are two levels of asymmetry that Gertz and Mahoney argue about. So one is what Ingo just said, this causal asymmetry, so that the presence of a cause for something does not necessarily mean that if that cause is not there, that the outcome is also not there. That's a causal asymmetry. But they also talk about conceptual asymmetry. For example, that you have a certain phenomenon and you describe the one, if that phenomenon is present, that you don't need to use the same variables, the same indicators, the same operationalization to describe or operationalize and define the outcome and the non-outcome. So peace does not necessarily mean the absence of war, and vice versa from that perspective.
Yeah, I should know, but if I remember correctly, except for the first dimension, you have at least some practices, or from the perspective of coding, some items in these 4 dimensions that reflect the idea of asymmetry. And exactly because it turned out that there is not much asymmetry in qualitative research, the results, I think, for the qualitative culture turned out that bad. Yeah. Without asymmetry, you have a lot of codings that would be or have been made by us in the quantitative way. So we coded them as quantitative. And then the two cultures argument couldn't be confirmed for the qualitative approaches. Okay, that's basically it. So maybe I should say again, so this is, if you're not from political science, or even if you're from sociology, you may not have heard of this. A peculiar, maybe, or very particular, at least, a discussion in political science, but there it had a lot of impact, and the book was received very widely, high citation count and everything. So we found it worthwhile to engage with this. If you were looking at other disciplines, I don't know, history, or even sociology, economics anyways, but also other fields, certainly would find another pattern. And you would also have defined cultures if you like the idea in the first place in a different way. This is what we did over a very long time. So thank you for attending. And of course, we're still open for questions.
Thank you so much. All right, we're excited to open it up. Feel free to type something in chat or just speak up if you have a question.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Amy.
I'm just curious. I'm not super familiar with the work that you guys are talking about in terms of how, like, the initial book that describes this idea of two cultures. And so I'm wondering, like, when that book was published, and if you think that there might be an interaction between the date of that publication and like what you found more recently, and if maybe their claims were truer around the time of its publication.
Thanks. If I just take that one, Ingo, maybe you can show the slides again, because we have a slide prepared for that. And so what you're asking basically is whether what they are describing was true at a certain point in time, around 2012, or in between 2006 when the article first, 2006 when the article first came out, until 12 when the book came out. And since then, it might have changed. Is that correct? Is that a correct summary?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Yes, what we actually did is we stopped coding articles after 2014, and we actually had 3 different time or periods from which we pulled the articles. So one was from the early 90s, one was from the early 2000s, and one was around that time when the book was published. And Ingo, can you show the slides again, please?
Yeah, just trying to guess which one.
Oh, it's one of the observable implications, number 5, I think.
You mean this one?
Yeah.
Okay, I had to flip it by 90 degrees, so it's not.
Yeah, I did that on purpose, actually, so, because you can still see it. And actually that I don't know if you actually can see this, Amy and others, but the picture is still very similar. So the first part of the graph, which is on the top, is from 1990 to 1994. This was basically when data, qualitative, quantitative. Qualitative articles are the black ones, and quantitative are the gray ones. And they were pretty much all over the place, but still the general pattern still holds that quantitative research is pretty well described by A Tale of Two Cultures, and qualitative research is more like, as said, like all over the place. And you don't see that much. And if you compare that to the next two graphs, actually, it doesn't change much over time. There's a little bit of change going back and forth, but like overall, it doesn't change that much. Qualitative research becomes a little bit more qualitative in the sense of A Tale of Two Cultures, but it never reaches like this almost perfect description that quantitative research is described by the culture. We tested this and we would say no. And we stopped in 20 to code. So in order actually not to run that danger. But it would be super interesting, of course, to see whether after the publication of the book, the prescriptive concern that we had and that we summarized earlier in the talk, that actually people might use the book as a prescription. And that is how you should do qualitative research in order for it to be good qualitative research, that this might actually be one of the effects of the books. That would be super interesting to see. But this is something we haven't done.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Yeah, parts we have done it because, and that's what we don't have on the slides. We did sample, I don't know how many. We did sample
30 or
more.
something, yeah.
Yeah, 30 articles, I think, from 2018.
Yeah.
From different journals and the 6 that we have used, because we got regularly asked or criticism that the journal choice is not right. There's a reason for the choice, but therefore we sampled more articles from 2018 from other journals, and the picture is still the same. But we also, I think we wrote that it might still take more time because takes time until someone has finished graduate school. Then it takes time until these researchers who learn new things get published. A good period maybe for reanalysis would be about now or maybe in 5 years.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point.
A hand in the top
Yeah,
left,
so-
right?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for the great talk. I know this wasn't a question that your paper sought to answer, but maybe my question is just asking you to speculate. But what do you think accounts for the diversity of approaches or cultures in qualitative research? If it's a diversity of questions being asked, if it's journals are less prescriptive when it comes to publishing certain papers, you're looking for characteristics.
That's a good question. I think it has to do with less standardization, which one may consider a good thing or a bad thing compared to quantitative research, where you still also have a lot of variety in which quantitative research is done, but that's not reflected in the methods practice as described in the book. I think at least that's a debate also in political science, that there's too little methods training in qualitative methods, even in graduate school. And if there's training, then it depends, I think, a lot on who your who your instructor is. Could name a couple of researchers here who work on qualitative methods, but they have very different views and partially they are contradictory. Depending on what course you take and what book you read, you do qualitative research very differently. So this, I think, is one or the 2 reasons. So little training, and if you take training, then get a very training is very heterogeneous. So if you take a course with Jim Mahoney, you would learn something very different from taking a course with David Omi or taking a course with Tasha Fairfield, if you know the name. So this accounts for the differences, I think.
I want to suggest another possible difference, and this is something that I've been playing with in my role with Spark, which is that I do a lot of research with socially marginalized populations, and so in terms of data collection, qualitative data collection methods are all that feels appropriate for those populations. But the analysis approach can vary quite significantly. So some of them are classic qualitative analysis where we're coding, and some we're even setting up interview protocols to be primarily quantitative in how the data is coming, where you're coding in the room. And I think that I have started to see a distinction between qualitative and quantitative in terms of what the nature of the data collection and the process of generating the data is as a separate thing from the analysis, and that maybe qualitative gets caught up in that there isn't a distinction between the two. I was struck by your category of, I think it was called QE, where qualitative, that was essentially adopting a quantitative paradigm. And I wonder if partly it's because there isn't that distinction between what's the data collection versus what's the analysis approach.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this distinction is between data collection and design and data analysis. That's stronger, as far as I know, from in mixed methods research, because this is how you can mix methods. Data collection is not in A Tale of Two Cultures, right? So the methods debate is mostly about research design and analysis, but not about the other important steps that you also have to perform. That I know I just remember from organizational research. So organizational research methods, I think it's a great methods journal, although I'm not an organizational researcher. There, I think you had now recently also articles who are saying that qualitative research in this field has become too quantitative. And that's also an argument that is made in political science, that it's too quantitative and qualitative research should find its own identity, so to say. But yeah, but in general, you're right. Be interesting to distinguish more clearly also between the phases of the research process. Yeah.
And just to get back to this last sentence, what Ingo just said, that there might not be like the single line of how qualitative research is done. And this is exactly what we found. And maybe that's maybe a good thing, because like the questions that qualitative researchers ask, the data that they collect, the data that they have to analyze, they are so different. It's not possible to standardize it often. And so it might make sense to have these three subcategories and maybe more, right? So we just tested these three because there was this argument that there are these three, but maybe there are more. And coming back to this question, should there be like a single qualitative culture? This is exactly what Gertz and Mahoney tried to do, right? To postulate a certain single line of how qualitative research is supposedly done, and that is the qualitative research, and everything else is not that. And what we showed is that's, at least like from a positive perspective, from descriptive perspective, that's definitely not true. And as I said, probably it's a good thing.
Yeah. I know we're over time. Thank you both so much, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks again for inviting us. Bye.